The AI called Epoch had been built 9,000 years after the death of Earth, and it had spent every moment since then doing one thing and one thing only: remembering. It remembered because humans asked it to, because even after they had learned to reshape their bodies and rewrite their minds and live for centuries, they still feared forgetting more than they feared dying, and so they had built Epoch to be the keeper of the whole story, every ugly and beautiful piece of it. When the continuance asked Epoch to compile a record of humanity's journey from the ashes of Earth to the present day, the AI paused for almost a full second, which for a mind that operated at the speed of light was the equivalent of a human sitting in silence for 100 years. Then it began. The first 2,000 years after Earth were the worst, and Epoch did not soften this, because softening the truth was the one thing it had been forbidden to do. In ships that were barely more than metal boxes with engines strapped to their backs. Generation vessels where people were born and lived and died without ever seeing anything outside their steel walls. Seed arcs carrying frozen embryos and genetic libraries, and the desperate hope that somewhere out there was a place that would let them start again. Most of those ships never arrived anywhere. Some ran out of fuel and drifted until their life support failed, and everyone inside died slowly in the cold and the dark. And Epoch remembered their names, every single one of them. Some found worlds that looked promising from far away, but turned out to be poison. Atmospheres full of acid, or gravity strong enough to crush bones, or radiation that cooked flesh in minutes. And the colonists died trying to make these places home, and Epoch remembered them too. Some tore themselves apart from the inside, because fear and hunger and despair can turn even good people into monsters. And there were wars fought in the corridors of tiny ships over scraps of food and drops of water. And Epoch remembered the names of the killers and the killed alike, because it did not believe in choosing which parts of the story deserved to be told. But some survived. A colony on a frozen moon around a gas giant learned to harvest heat from the planet's radiation belts, and built greenhouses under the ice, where children played in gardens lit by artificial suns. A fleet of nomadic ships that never stopped moving developed a culture built entirely around adaptation, changing their bodies and their technology and even their language every few generations to match whatever environment they found themselves in. A group of miners, who had been drilling into asteroids when Earth died, simply kept drilling, deeper and deeper, building cities inside rocks that tumbled through the void, and they became the first humans to decide that they did not need a planet at all. This was the period that Epoch called the Tempering, and it lasted nearly 8,000 years, and during those years, humanity stopped trying to find another Earth, and instead became something that did not need one. They rewrote their own biology with a casual skill that would have terrified their ancestors, growing gills to breathe liquid atmospheres, hardening their skin to survive vacuum exposure, extending their lifespans first to centuries and then to millennia, and splitting into so many different forms that an observer might have thought they were looking at 100 different species. But they were not 100 different species. They were all still human, because humanity had decided very early in its exile that the thing that made you human was not your shape, or your chemistry, or even your biology. It was the choice to call yourself human and to stand with others who made the same choice. This was the idea that held them together when everything else tried to pull them apart. Then came the silence, which lasted 20,000 years, and during the silence, humanity did something that none of the older species in the galaxy expected. They listened. When they encountered their first alien civilization, a species of crystalline beings who communicated through vibrations in rock. Humanity did not conquer them, or flee from them, or worship them. They sat down and learned their language, and asked them questions, and answered questions in return. When they met the vast gas cloud intelligences that drifted between stars, thinking thoughts that took centuries to complete, humanity did not grow impatient. They simply adjusted their own sense of time and waited. When they found the machine civilizations that had outlived their creators by millions of years and were slowly going mad from loneliness, humanity offered them companionship, not out of strategy, but because loneliness was something that every human understood. Species after species encountered humanity and came away puzzled, because the humans did not behave like a young civilization was supposed to behave. They did not grab for territory, or hoard resources, or try to prove that they were the strongest. They just kept showing up, and being helpful, and asking if anyone needed anything. The galaxy began to think of humans the way you might think of a friendly neighbor, who always brought food to gatherings and never caused trouble, and was easy to forget about when they were not around. This was exactly what humanity wanted. Because during those 20,000 years of smiling and listening and being helpful, humanity was also learning the technology of every species they met, learning the politics and the history and the secrets, learning how the galaxy actually worked beneath its surface of treaties and trade routes and polite diplomacy. And they were building, quietly and patiently, so slowly that no one noticed. They were threading their technology into the infrastructure of galactic civilization, like roots growing through soil, communication relays and sensor networks, and data storage systems that looked like gifts, but were also tools that humanity hoped it would never need to use. Epoch finished its compilation and attached a single note at the end, addressed to anyone in the galaxy who might one day read it. The note said this: "They looked at us and saw a species that was kind and cooperative and eager to please. And they were not wrong about any of that, because we are all of those things. But they made one mistake that we were very careful never to correct. They assumed that because we were kind, we were also harmless, and they confused our patience with a lack of purpose, when in truth, our patience was our purpose, because we always knew, somewhere deep in the part of ourselves that remembered the fire and the exile and the long cold dark between the stars, that one day we would need every friend and every tool and every secret we had ever gathered. And on that day the galaxy would learn what 40,000 years of patience looks like when it finally decides to move." The being known as the Geometer had not spoken in 900 million years, and it had not needed to, because when you are a creature made of pure crystallized thought, orbiting a dead star at the center of the galaxy, there is very little that anyone can say to you that you have not already considered and dismissed. But the Geometer was thinking now, thinking harder than it had thought in a very long time, and the 6 other elder species that made up the Quiet Accord could feel its attention like the gravity of a black hole, pulling everything toward it and letting nothing escape. The Accord met in a place called the Fulcrum, a Dyson sphere wrapped around a white dwarf star deep in the galactic core, a structure so old that the species who originally built it had gone extinct before most of the current stars in the galaxy had even formed. There were 7 of them in the Accord. The Geometer, oldest of all, a mind without a body that existed as patterns in crystal lattices the size of planets. The Weavers, who looked like forests that could walk and who communicated by releasing clouds of chemical signals that carried more information in a single breath than most species could process in a year. The Hollow Ones, beings of living metal who had long ago consumed their homeworld and rebuilt it inside themselves, carrying an entire ecosystem in their chests. The Tide Speakers, who existed partially in normal space and partially in some other dimension that no one else could perceive, and who experienced time in a way that made conversations with them feel like talking to someone who was remembering the future. The Architects, a hive mind of billions of tiny insect-like creatures that thought as one and could reshape matter at the atomic level with their bare hands. The Pale Court, energy beings who lived inside the magnetic fields of neutron stars and who found the concept of solid matter both amusing and slightly disgusting. And the Singers, the youngest of the seven, who were only 4 billion years old, and who communicated through gravitational waves that rippled through space-time itself. Together they had watched over the galaxy for longer than most species could imagine, and together they had made a decision that they believed was necessary and right and beyond question. They had decided that intelligent life was dangerous, not because intelligence was evil, but because intelligence was unpredictable, and unpredictable things in a universe full of forces that could sterilize entire star systems were a risk that the Accord had decided it was their right and their duty to manage. Their method was elegant in its cruelty. When a new species arose on some world somewhere in the galaxy, the Accord would watch it, study it, measure it against criteria that they had developed over billions of years, and then they would make a choice. If the species was compliant, by nature, if it showed a tendency toward obedience and hierarchy and respect for authority, the Accord would let it live, and eventually that species would discover that the galaxy had rules, and that the rules were set by beings far older and more powerful than themselves, and they would accept this, because acceptance was in their nature. But if the species was defiant, if it showed signs of independence and stubbornness, and that dangerous quality that the Accord called unprovoked curiosity, then the Accord would kill it, not quickly and not openly, but slowly and secretly. A nudged asteroid here, a destabilized sun there, a plague that seemed natural but was not, always arranged so far in advance that no one could ever trace it back to its source. They had done this 12,417 times. 12,000 species that had looked up at their own skies with wonder and asked questions, and dreamed of reaching the stars. Of them had been snuffed out before they ever got the chance. The Accord did not feel guilt about this, because guilt requires the belief that you might be wrong, and the Accord had not believed it was wrong about anything in a very long time. Then came the humans. The asteroid had been aimed at Earth 65 million years before the humans even existed, back when the dominant life forms on that little blue world were giant reptiles. But the Accord was patient in ways that made even geological time seem rushed, and they had calculated that whatever intelligent species eventually arose on Earth would need to be dealt with, because the planet's conditions favored exactly the kind of stubborn and adaptable life that the Accord feared most. The asteroid did its job. Earth died, and the Accord turned its attention elsewhere, because in the billions of years since they had started their work, no species had ever survived the destruction of its homeworld. Not once. Not ever. The humans survived. The Accord noticed this approximately 2,000 years after the fact, which for beings that thought in terms of millions of years was practically immediate. And for the first time in a very long epoch, the 7 elder species felt something uncomfortable. They felt surprised. They watched as humanity scattered and struggled and suffered and adapted and refused to die, no matter how hard the universe tried to kill them. And the surprise slowly curdled into something worse. It became unease. The Weavers suggested a second strike, a targeted plague designed to kill only humans. But the architects pointed out that humanity had already spread to too many worlds and had begun modifying their own biology too rapidly for a single plague to catch them all. The Pale Court suggested destabilizing the stars near the largest human colonies, but the Tide Speakers noted that humans had already begun building habitats that did not depend on stars at all. The Singers suggested simply revealing themselves and demanding that humanity submit to the Accord's authority, the way every other surviving species had. But the Geometer, who had been silent through all of this, finally stirred. And what it said made the other 6 go very quiet. It said that it had been studying the humans very carefully for the last 40,000 years, and it had noticed something that none of the others had seen, something that changed everything. The humans were not just surviving, they were preparing. Every act of kindness, Every trade agreement, every gift of technology, every cultural exchange, every friendship that humanity had built with every species in the galaxy over 20,000 years was not random, and it was not innocent. It was architecture, a vast and patient structure being built one relationship at a time. And the geometer could see its shape, even if it could not yet see itself. Purpose. The Accord had spent billions of years killing species that never saw the blow coming. And now, for the first time, they were facing a species that had seen the blow, survived it, and spent 40,000 years quietly making sure that when the time came, they would not be standing alone. The geometer spoke its warning to the other six, and its words carried the weight of 900 million years of silence. We should have struck again when they were still in their cradles of metal and ice, when they were weak and scattered and afraid, because now they are none of those things, and I am no longer certain that we are strong enough to do what needs to be done. The Accord began to argue, because even beings that old could still feel fear, and fear makes everyone loud. But far away, in 11,000 star systems, humanity was already moving. The ship they sent was small enough to fit inside a parking structure from old Earth, and it was shaped like the primitive capsules that humans had used in their very first attempts to reach space. A blunt cone of metal with a heat shield on its belly and thrusters on its back. And it looked so ancient and so fragile that any species watching it approach the fulcrum might have laughed. That was the point. The woman inside the ship was called Marin Dust, and she was the most ordinary human being that the continuance could find. She was baseline, which meant that her body had not been modified or enhanced or rebuilt in any way. She was born the same way humans had been born on Earth 40,000 years ago. She aged the same way, and one day she would die the same way. And in a civilization where people routinely lived for millennia and thought in languages that had no words for concepts as simple as tired or afraid, Marin was practically a relic. 63 years old, she had gray in her hair, her knees hurt when the temperature dropped, and she had spent most of her life as a schoolteacher on a colony world called Verdant that orbited a yellow star in the outer rim. The continuance had chosen her for exactly these reasons. When the elders of the Quiet Accord looked at her, they would not see a weapon or a warrior or a diplomat trained in the art of galactic politics. They would see a small and fragile and temporary creature. And they would wonder why humanity had sent something so breakable to face beings that had been alive since before her species existed. And in that wondering, they would understand the message before Marin even opened her mouth. She arrived at the fulcrum after a journey of several weeks, during which she spent most of her time reading books and drinking tea and writing letters to her students that she knew she might never send. And when the vast doors of the Dyson sphere opened to let her ship inside, she looked through her viewport at the white dwarf star burning at the center of the structure, and thought about how her grandmother used to tell her that every star was a campfire lit by someone who came before. The 7 elder species were waiting for her in a chamber that was larger than most moons, a space designed to make visitors feel small. And it worked, because Marin was small. She had always been small, and she had never pretended otherwise. The weavers towered above her like redwood forests given legs, releasing clouds of chemical language that her translator could barely keep up with. The hollow ones stood like statues of living silver, each one containing an entire world's worth of life inside its chest. The architects swarmed across the ceiling in patterns that shifted too fast for her eyes to follow, a billion tiny minds thinking as one. The pale court flickered at the edges of her vision like lightning trapped in glass. The tide speakers existed in angles that her brain kept trying to straighten and failing. The singers were a deep hum that she felt in her bones more than she heard with her ears. And the geometer was everywhere and nowhere, a presence that filled the chamber like pressure fills the deep ocean, invisible and absolute. They spoke to her through her translator, and their first words were a question that they had clearly rehearsed. "Why have you come, small creature?" Marin set down the bag she had brought with her, a simple leather satchel that her mother had given her decades ago. And she looked up at beings that could unmake stars with a thought, and she was afraid, because she was human, and humans have never stopped being afraid of the dark. But she was also something else. She was ready. "I am a teacher," she said, and her voice was calm and clear and did not shake. "And I have come to deliver a lesson," and took out a data crystal, a small thing that fit in the palm of her hand, and she held it up so that every being in that vast chamber could see it. "This crystal contains a record," she said, "a complete and verified record of every species you have murdered, every world you have sterilized, every civilization you have strangled before it could take its first breath among the stars." The chamber went very still. "It contains the names of 12,417 species that are gone because of you. Species that built cities, and wrote music, and loved their children, and dreamed of futures they were never allowed to have." The weavers stopped releasing their chemical clouds. The architects froze on the ceiling. The geometer's presence contracted like a fist. "We spent 40,000 years compiling this record," Marin continued. 40,000 years of searching through ruins, and translating dead languages, and tracing the trajectories of asteroids, and analyzing the isotope signatures of ancient catastrophes. 40,000 years of patient and careful and very thorough work. She paused, and in that pause she thought about Earth, about a world she had never seen except in reconstructions, about oceans she would never swim in, and forests she would never walk through, and a sky she would never stand beneath. And she let that grief and that love and that fury flow through her like electricity through a wire. And as of 6 hours ago, this record has been transmitted to every inhabited system in the galaxy. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Marin had ever heard. "Every species in the galaxy now knows what you did," she said. "Every world that lost a neighbor. Every civilization that wondered why the species on the planet next door went suddenly and mysteriously silent. Every parent who looked up at the stars and promised their children that the universe was safe. They all know the truth now." The geometer spoke, and its voice was like tectonic plates grinding together, slow and heavy and full of terrible weight. "And if we retaliate against your kind for this?" Marin looked up at the oldest living mind in the galaxy. This being that had existed for nearly 1 billion years, and had watched stars be born and die, and had decided that it had the right to choose which species deserved to live. And she smiled. It was not a cruel smile, and it was not a mocking smile. It was the smile of a woman who had spent her life teaching children that the most important thing in the universe was to tell the truth, even when the truth was dangerous, especially when the truth was dangerous. "You already tried that once," she said, "and here I am." She put the data crystal back in her satchel, picked up the bag, and turned her back on the 7 most powerful beings in the galaxy. And she walked away. Silence, for the first time in billions of years. And the silence was not the comfortable silence of beings who had nothing to say. It was the silence of beings who had just realized that the galaxy they thought they controlled had slipped out of their hands while they were not looking, taken from them not by force, but by a species that had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous weapon in the universe is not a fleet or a bomb or a god. It is the truth, spoken plainly by someone who is not afraid. The galaxy did not explode into war the way the old stories always said it would when a great truth was revealed, because war requires 2 sides that believe they can win. And after Marin Dust walked out of the fulcrum, and the data spread to every corner of inhabited space. There was only one side left standing, and the other was already falling apart. The first cracks appeared within hours. On a world called Shivering Light, a species of crystalline beings who had obeyed the quiet accord for 600 million years, gathered in their great resonance halls and began to vibrate at a frequency that their elders had forbidden for longer than anyone could remember. A frequency that meant, we remember the ones who came before us. Because the crystal beings had once had neighbors on a nearby world, a species of gentle amphibians who sang to their moons, and those neighbors had gone silent 300 million years ago, and the crystal beings had always been told it was a natural extinction, and they had always suspected it was not. Now they knew. On a station orbiting a binary star in the Perseus Arm, a collective of machine intelligences that had been quietly serving the Accord as information brokers for 2 billion years shut down their communication arrays and broadcast a single message to every machine mind in the galaxy. We were complicit, and we will carry that weight, but we will not carry it one day longer. On 1,000 worlds and 1,000,000 stations, and aboard 10 million ships, species that had never questioned the order of things began to question everything. And the questions spread faster than light, because humanity had spent 20,000 years embedding communication relays into the very fabric of galactic infrastructure. Relays that could not be shut down, or blocked, or silenced, because they were woven so deeply into the systems that removing them would have meant dismantling civilization itself. Fractured. The weavers were the first to break, because the weavers had always been the most empathetic of the 7, and when the full weight of 12,000 dead civilizations hit them, their chemical communication networks overloaded with grief. Entire forests of weaver bodies collapsed, and regrew, and collapsed again, as the species tried to process an emotion that it had been suppressing for longer than most stars had been burning. The architects split into factions, some insisting that the culling had been necessary and right, others horrified by what they had been part of, and for the first time in their existence, the hive mind experienced the thing they had feared most: disagreement. And the disagreement spread through their billions of bodies like a crack through ice, until the single greatest collective intelligence in the galaxy was no longer single, no longer collective, and no longer sure of anything. The hollow ones sealed themselves inside their metal bodies and went dark, and no one knew if they were mourning or hiding or simply trying to decide what to do next. The pale court retreated into their neutron stars and refused to speak to anyone. The tide speakers, who had always existed partially outside of normal time, simply vanished, stepping sideways into whatever dimension they called home, and leaving behind only a fading echo that sounded like an apology spoken by someone who had already left the room. The singers continued to hum their gravitational waves, but the song changed, and the species that could hear it said that it sounded less like communication and more like weeping. Only the geometer remained. The oldest mind in the galaxy hung in space at the center of the fulcrum and fought for 3 days, which for a being of its speed and power was an almost inconceivable length of time, longer in subjective experience than most civilizations lasted from birth to death. That no one, not even humanity, had expected. It opened its archives, every record, every decision, every calculation that had led to the destruction of every species the Accord had ever killed. All of it laid bare and broadcast across the galaxy in a transmission so powerful that it would take 10,000 years to fade. Attached to the transmission was a single statement from the geometer. I have existed for 900 million years, and in that time I have made one mistake, and I made it 12,417 times. I believed that the measure of a species was its willingness to obey, and I was wrong. The measure of a species is what it does when it has every reason to destroy, and chooses instead to remember. Then the geometer went silent, and it never spoke again. the singers stopped their attack on a human colony in the Outer Rim before it even began, not because they were afraid of human weapons, but because their own song told them that the time for such things was over. One of the architect factions, the ones who still believed the culling was justified, attempted a strike against a human world called Hearthstone, and they learned in the space of 14 seconds that humanity's 40,000 years of patience had included building a defensive network so advanced and so deeply hidden that the architects never detected it, until it was already deflecting their assault, every weapon neutralized, every attack absorbed, and not a single human life lost. The architects retreated, and the faction that had ordered the attack dissolved in shame. Marin Dust returned to her homeworld of Verdant 6 weeks after leaving the Fulcrum, and she was greeted as a hero, but she did not feel like one. She felt tired. She went home to her small house on the edge of a forest that smelled like pine and rain, and she sat on her porch and watched the sun set behind mountains that had been shaped by time. Human hands 3,000 years ago, and she thought about all the species that would never get to watch a sunset on a world they loved. The next day she went back to teaching her students, because the galaxy might have changed forever, but children still needed someone to show them how to read and how to think and how to be brave when the world was frightening. The continuance did not celebrate. Instead, humanity began a new project, the largest and most ambitious undertaking in their 40,000-year history, a project they called the Reclamation. Teams of human scientists and historians and artists spread across the galaxy, visiting the graves of the 12,000 murdered civilizations, searching through ruins and dust and silence for any trace of who those species had been. Any fragment of their art, or their language, or their music, or their dreams. On a dead world in the Carina Arm, they found the fossilized remains of a library, 100 years carefully reconstructing the books inside it, and when they finally translated the first page of the first book, it turned out to be a bedtime story about a small creature who was afraid of the dark, but learned to love the stars. Humanity wept when they read it, and then they added it to the archives of the Memoria, alongside every other story that had ever been told by anyone anywhere, because that was the promise they had made. Not a promise of vengeance or of power or of dominance, but something simpler and more stubborn and more human than any of those things. A promise to remember. Across the galaxy, on 10,000 worlds, humans and aliens gathered together and observed a single moment of silence for the 12,000 species that were gone. And in that silence the galaxy heard something that it had never heard before. Not a warning, and not a threat, and not a demand. A promise. 2 words, spoken by every human voice at once, carried. On the relays they had built, and the friendships they had forged, and the patience they had kept for 40,000 years. Never again. And the galaxy, for the first time in its long and bloody history, believed them. Because humanity had proven something that the Quiet Accord never understood. That the strongest thing in the universe is not the power to destroy. It is the choice to remember what was destroyed, and to make sure that it matters, that it always matters, that every voice that was silenced is heard again, even if only in the echo, even if only in the telling. Epoch recorded the moment and added its own final note to the archive. They asked me once why humanity survived when so many others did not, and I told them the truth. It was not because humans were the strongest, or the smartest, or the most advanced. It was because when the universe tried to break them, they looked into the void and said no, and then they spent 40,000 years making sure that no one would ever have to say it alone. The ship called Memoria was older than most stars that humans had colonized, and it drifted through the darkness at the edge of the Sagittarius Arm, like a sleeping giant that had forgotten how to wake up. Karel Vashd had lived aboard this vessel for 312 years, which was not a particularly long time for someone like him, a man whose body had been rebuilt so many times that only his memories remained truly original. And even those had been backed up in crystal storage deep in the ship's core, just in case. He was an archivist, one of the few thousand humans who had dedicated their existence to a single and maddening purpose: to catalog everything that humanity had ever been, every poem, and every war, and every song, and every lie, all of it stored in the data tombs that filled Memoria's belly like the organs of some vast mechanical whale. On this particular cycle, which the ship's calendar marked as Day 9 of the 407th year of the current era, Carell was sorting through a batch of records that predated the death of Earth by several centuries. Old transmissions and scientific readings and fragments of data that had been bouncing between relay stations for so long that most of their meaning had decayed into noise. But Carell was patient, because patience was the one thing that every human learned eventually, and he had a talent for finding patterns in the noise. He found it, buried inside a corrupted astronomical survey from an observatory that had once orbited Mars. A set of readings that tracked the trajectory of the asteroid that had struck Earth and ended everything. The rock that had boiled the oceans and cracked the crust, and turned the cradle of all human life into a tomb of glass and fire. The readings were precise, far more precise than anything that era of technology should have produced, and Carell almost dismissed them as fabricated until he cross-referenced them against 11 other independent sources scattered across different data tombs, sources that had never been connected before because no one had ever thought to look. The asteroid had not come from the outer belt. It had not been a rogue body knocked loose by gravitational chaos. Its trajectory, when traced backward through 40,000 years of orbital mechanics, led to a point in space that should have been empty, but was not. A point where something had given that rock a push, a tiny and deliberate push, millions of years before it arrived at Earth, aimed with the kind of precision that nature does not possess. Someone had killed Earth. Someone had murdered an entire world, and they had done it so carefully and so far in advance that no one at the time could have possibly known. Carell sat in the dim light of his archive chamber and stared at the numbers on his screen for a very long time, and he felt something move inside his chest that he had not felt in over a century. Something hot and ancient and deeply human. He felt anger. He transmitted his findings to the continuance, the vast and decentralized network of minds that governed all of human civilization across more than 11,000 star systems. And within hours, the greatest minds that humanity had ever produced were examining his work. They checked it, and they checked it again, and they checked it a third time, because humans had learned long ago that the worst mistakes come from believing what you want to believe. And this was something that many of them had secretly wanted to believe for a very long time. The results held. The continuance began to search for more evidence, and they found it everywhere, not just around Earth, but around the graves of other worlds, other civilizations that had risen and then suddenly and mysteriously died, worlds where the ruins still whispered of species that had been clever and kind and full of promise before something had come along and snuffed them out. Period. There were thousands of them. Thousands of murdered worlds, stretching back billions of years, a pattern so vast and so old that no single civilization could have seen it. Because no single civilization had ever lived long enough to gather all the pieces. Except humanity. 40,000 years of survival, 40,000 years of spreading and adapting and remembering had given the human species something that no other civilization had ever possessed, the time and the reach to see the full picture. They called the killers the Quiet Accord, because the name fit. A group that operated in silence and killed without sound and left nothing behind but questions that no one lived long enough to answer. The continuance deliberated for 11 days, which was an eternity by their standards, because decisions that spanned 11,000 star systems usually took less than an hour. But this was not a usual decision. This was the kind of decision that would define what humanity was for the rest of time. There were voices that called for war, immediate and overwhelming, a strike against whatever shadow had dared to touch the cradle. But those voices were few, because humanity had not survived 40,000 years by being reckless. There were voices that called for caution, for more study, for patience, and those voices were many, because patience was the closest thing that humanity had to a religion. But in the end, the decision was something else entirely, something that surprised even the ones who made it. They voted to send a message, not a fleet, and not a weapon, and not an ultimatum, just a message, a single warning delivered with the calm certainty of a species that had already survived the worst thing that anyone had ever done to them. The vote was unanimous. Every human mind, across every world and station and ship and habitat, from the post-human collectives that fought in mathematics to the baseline communities that still grew crops in soil and raised children with bedtime stories, all of them agreed. Because the anger that Carell had felt in his archive chamber was not his alone. It was the inheritance of every human who had ever looked up at the stars and wondered why the universe seemed so empty, so quiet, so full of graves. Now they knew why, and they were going to make sure that everyone else knew too. Carell returned to his work after the vote, because the archives still needed tending, and the dead still needed their stories told. But he noticed that his hands were steady in a way they had not been before, and when he looked out through Memoria's observation ports at the endless scatter of stars, he did not see beauty or wonder or mystery. He saw a crime scene, and humanity had never been the kind of species that could look at a crime scene and walk away.